Welcome to the Thyroidless Life podcast with me, Dr. Rebecca Warren. This podcast is for you if you've been diagnosed with a thyroid disorder, think you might have a thyroid disorder, or are healing after thyroidectomy. I'm doing this podcast because of my own personal health journey of being diagnosed with thyroid cancer, getting my thyroid cut out, getting high-dose radiation, and being left with no answers when my health started to deteriorate quickly. It wasn't until I drew a line in the sand that my health transformed, and now I've dedicated my life to sharing this information so others don't have to go down that same path. My hope is that you never feel alone on your health journey and that you understand how incredible your body is, that it's not working against you, it's working with you, and it wants to be well. All right, so I'm so excited for today's episode. It's going to be so important for all women who listen to it. And it's information that I wish I understood right from the beginning, especially when I was looking at how do I best support my thyroid hormones. Now, I do understand that some of this can get a little deep and it might be new to you, or, tracking and all of that can seem a little complicated. But I want to assure you that this is what I walk through within my Thyroid Inner Circle community. Now, this Thyroid Inner Circle community, it's a membership program. That is how you work with me. The doors are open for those that want to sign up and join this community. In this community, we walk through different topics like this. Not only do we go deeper where you can actually ask me questions, but then we have separate times where we can troubleshoot and go through even what you might be struggling with or specific needs that you might have. Again, I get asked all the time, how do I work with you? This is it. This community is my heart. It's been on my mind and on my spirit to do it for so long because I wanted to create a place that you could go to have hope, to feel educated, empowered, and equipped to not just understand your own case, but how to get better each year. So if you're interested in that, if you want to go deeper, if you're like, man, I need this type of support system, go to thyroidinnercircle.com. So Thyroid Inner Circle, I'll put a link in the bio and you can join there. I want to make sure you join before the doors are closed and get started with this incredible healing journey within this community. And I'm so excited to see you guys there. All right. So today I want to talk about the importance of understanding the connection between what's going on with your thyroid hormones and your sex hormones. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about menstruating women. And then the second part of this episode, which is going to be a different episode, I'll be talking about perimenopause and going into menopause, because there's just so much information that I think we need to focus on those two things separately. So I've shared my journey on healing and, post-thyroidectomy. So not only did I have my thyroid removed, but then I was also just mistreated when it came to my thyroid meds. So I was okay on paper, but I had all the symptoms and all the signs of having hypothyroidism. And so what I've done with coaching women that have gone through hypothyroid states or have done post-thyroidectomy is I always share that first, there's two phases of healing. It's very symptom-based at the beginning, like how can we get your head above water? And then the second phase is just going deeper and just getting better. Because health should be a process where you feel like you're getting better over time, which is a very contrarian idea to what we're told, especially within medicine, about aging. Aging, and even in our country, like in a lot of countries, as they're getting, a lot of more Western ideals, but a lot of industrialized countries, we all kind of look as growing older as, losing memory, not being as active, nursing homes and all these things. And it shouldn't be like that. The idea should be that you should be getting better and you can get better, right? As long as you are understanding, especially when it comes to your thyroid, that like you have to understand what's going on with those hormones. You have to trust what your body is telling you and then put into action, the things that you've got to do to get better. So for this episode, we're going to be focusing on sex hormones when it comes to women. Now, man, I've worked with thousands of women in many different settings, one-on-one, group coaching. I used to do group programs, Facebook groups. I've done a lot of different things. And there is nothing that pisses me off more than how the medical system views women's health and women's hormones. It just pisses me off. Okay. Because when it comes to our sex hormones, it's pretty much treated like, if you're younger, and you're having problems, the idea is that, well, are you trying to get pregnant? Like, are you trying to have kids, or are you wanting to have kids someday? You do? Okay, well, then we'll just put you on birth control and just literally kind of shut off the entire system, get you on a pill, and then have a pill bleed. And then when you're ready, wanting to have kids, then we'll deal with that later, right? Or, are you done having kids? Like, do you have kids already? Are you older? Well, just have a hysterectomy. And it just, that sucks because we're taught from such a young age that all the importance of our sex hormones is for baby making. And yeah, that's a really big deal, right? It's life changing, but there's so much more to our sex hormones than just can we get pregnant or not. But that is a big thing, right? But there's so much more to that. And when you're having issues with your hormones, it is not just something to be ignored. It affects your overall well-being. We're talking about your physical, emotional, and mental state. It affects how you view the world, how you view yourself, what you think you're capable of doing, how you interact with your loved ones. It affects your sanity, right? And I was going to say insanity because sometimes you can feel like you're losing your mind. Like, why do I feel this way? You wouldn't believe how many women I've worked with through the years that postpartum are really, really struggling. And honestly, like, there's so many different things for why postpartum is just awful, especially in America. But one thing I've found through the years is that I'll have women that are really struggling with like feelings and fatigue and all this stuff. And doctors kind of write it off because the focus is the baby and don't really check on the mom, check the mom's hormones, check the mom's labs, and they'll come in to see me. I'm like, let's do some testing. And there's all these deficiencies, there's all these things that are affecting how they're feeling in their hormones, and they're actually suffering more than they need to. They wrote it off as like, oh, I'm losing sleep, or you know this is just motherhood, having three, having two, having one baby, when in actuality, no, you're feeling so much worse like that because things are out of whack and it's not being looked at. So when it comes to sex hormones, in 2015, ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, they sent out this like nationwide memo here in the US where they're like, we need to start treating young women's menstrual cycles as a vital sign. And whenever I share this, because like when I came across this, I was like, number one, heck yes, this is how it should be. But number two, I started asking, I've worked with all ages. I've worked with women, 70, 80 years old, 90. I think my oldest patient was about like 92, 93, to young girls. And I've asked moms, I've asked different patients. When I read this, I would ask them, did your doctor track, your menstrual cycle? Did your doctor track X, Y, and Z within your menstrual? And the answers were always no, no, no. I don't know. There may have been a handful of women in the last 10 years that I've worked with that know when they ovulate, that know like how many days exactly their luteal phase is, how many days their follicular phase is. This is all vital information. Like when we're talking about vital sign, when you go to your doctor, you get your blood pressure checked, like you need to get your blood pressure checked. You need to get your temp checked, your heart rate. You get all these things checked because they're vital for your overall well-being. Not only is it vital, but like it gives you information about the state of your body. That is what your menstrual cycle is, right? And let me go ahead and clarify this. Your menstrual cycle isn't just when you're bleeding. That's when you're menstruating, right? Your menstrual cycle is day one bleed to when you bleed again. So the bleeding days and the no bleeding days until you bleed again, right? It's the whole cycle. There is so much information there. There's information on how you can avoid getting pregnant or how you can know the right times to get pregnant. It'll tell you if there's any issues, like if you're having symptoms in the follicular phase or, things happening in the follicular phase or in the luteal phase. It can give you some ideas on what path to take when it comes to your hormones. It can also just give you an understanding of where you're at. Listen, my husband and I practice together, okay? He's worked with women through the years, we talk, like he knows like where I might be at in my menstrual cycle to support me. There's times in the menstrual cycle where you just can't push, like you just aren't pushing yourself as hard in the gym. Like you can't reach those personal records. You're just feeling more tired. You might feel a little bit slower. You might just feel like you can't handle as much as the regular stressors that you can handle usually. You might be ovulating. You might be deep into your luteal phase and your body's telling you, no, it's time to kind of like cocoon away, slow down a little bit, like give yourself grace. These hormones, this is what your body's telling you. And then there's other times where your sex drive might be high and there's nothing weird or off. Like that's great. Like, cause I've had women like, I feel like I just, my sex drive is only for a few days, or I feel this. No, that's how it is. You can see testosterone spike up in certain parts of your cycle. You guys can plan for that. You can plan for times where you feel like you have more energy and you can really push it with exercising or what you're putting on your plate by understanding your menstrual cycle. And it's all going to be connected. We know that the thyroid, we know this without a doubt. We know active T3, which is what binds to the cell, which gives every like cell in your body the energy it needs to push forward and do what it's created to do. We know that when you're suboptimal with those thyroid hormones, either low, out of range, or low end of the range, we know it can affect your menstrual cycle. If it comes, if it doesn't come, if it's heavy, if it's light, if you're ovulating. I mean, if your body has to conserve energy, if your body's in a state of stress because your hormones, your thyroid hormones aren't optimal, your body is so intelligent, it's so smart, it is going to conserve energy. It's going to say, you know what, right now, fertility and these hormones, they're not as important as conserving energy for other parts in our body. And so you'll see a lot of things happen there if your thyroid hormones are not optimal. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We know when we're looking at fertility research, especially looking at what fertility clinics do, we know that keeping hormones very regulated, thyroid hormones, can affect miscarriages because it affects progesterone release, it affects ovulation. I mean, this is all connected, especially the thyroid, your sex hormones, and your adrenals are just so intimately connected. But what ends up happening is if you have a thyroid issue, if you have thyroid cancer or thyroid antibodies or something like that, you usually what end up having an endocrinologist that will focus on that. And then all your lady issues or all your lady things, then you got to go see an OBGYN for that. And then, if you're having energy issues or, go see your GP. And if you're having gut issues, go see a GI specialist. But no one's sitting down and making this connection for you like, hey, like this, you're not ovulating. And because you're not ovulating because your thyroid is way too low. Your active thyroid hormone is way too low. You're not ovulating because you're not ovulating. You're not releasing progesterone appropriately because you're not releasing progesterone for 2 weeks out of the month. You're feeling depressed, anxious, angry. You can't stand your partner. You're losing it on your kids. And it's all connected. You're not going crazy, right? Like I don't see women getting this type of care unless they're seeing someone, unless they've worked with me, they're in my thyroid membership group, unless they're seeing someone that is not only looking at the body as a whole, but is understanding that connection for women, right? And understanding that connection with thyroid hormones. So it's so important to not just ignore that, right? Like you've got to understand there's that connection there with the thyroid and your sex hormones, but how do you pay attention to your sex hormones? Like, what should you do? Let's talk about some active solutions. What ended up happening like 15, 18 years ago, 18 years ago, it's such a blur, like with practice and kids and marriage and all of that. How it's been so long since I went through my thyroid removal and everything I went through. But these steps is what I had to do as a patient. I did it myself. I did it off studies. I did it off books, articles, different things. And then I went deeper with it after I became a doctor of chiropractic and started doing functional wellness I went deeper with it and what studies were saying and then put it into practice. And I've helped thousands of women, right, understand their hormones. So, what are some things that you should understand if you're like, okay, is this connected? What should I start doing to really understand my hormones, right? Number one, you have to track your hormones. Now, when I talk about tracking your hormones, I'm not talking about you have an app that tells you, like, you put in when you got your period, and then it tells you through calculations, like when you ovulated and when you're going to get your period again. That's not what I'm talking about. And a good resource, I'll make sure to put this in the show notes, is the book Taking Charge of Your Fertility. I think every woman should own this. Every young girl should own this. Mom should be doing it with young girls. You know, I will be teaching this to my daughter right away. I want her to understand from the get go that her body does not fail her, that having a period isn't a curse, that she's not meant to suffer through her period, that it is a part of being a woman. It's a beautiful, amazing part of being a woman. Our hormones aren't there to just make us suffer. I'm going to, of course, make sure I help her through that, right? If there's any red flags along the way, we're going to address it. But what I've always said through the years is that your period should be an uneventful event. It should be, oh, my period's coming tomorrow, or, oof, I've been feeling like I need some extra carbs. My period must be coming. Like, that's how you should know. And when I started saying that to women through the years, they were always like, I know it's never been that way for me. And then when they get to that point, when they finally get to say, I get it, like my period came and I was actually surprised that it came because I wasn't paying attention. It just that's how it should be. If you're not there now, that's okay. We've got to figure out what's going on, right? So let's go and start with tracking your cycle. A good resource, like I said, is Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And I want you to understand, because this is something that I've used as a fertility awareness method. This is not natural family planning. Okay. This isn't pulling out, hoping for the best. This is not using for ovulation strips. No, this is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is understanding your fertility signs, understanding the shifts in your menstrual cycle, knowing where you're at, getting familiar with your body, looking at those signs. You know, you have to have fertile signs. You have to have signs like increased cervical fluid, so that sperm can survive, right? That so that it can move. You have to have a shift in temperature. You have to have an LH spike in progesterone. There has to be a change in your thyroid hormone. Those things have to occur for you to get pregnant. Those things aren't occurring, you're not going to get pregnant, right? I've worked with so many young girls through the years that are just so scared because they feel like they can get pregnant all the time. Like a young couple, I always remember I had to help them through this fear because they were like, no, like all we hear about is like this, for natural family method and people getting pregnant. We just can't. And they just could not understand that you can't get pregnant all 30 days of your cycle, right? But also understanding that means you also understand where you're at in your cycle, right? So where do you start? The first thing to understand is that you have your follicular phase and you have your luteal phase, right? Your follicular phase is the first part of your menstrual cycle, and the luteal phase is the second part of your menstrual cycle. Your follicular phase is where you're bleeding, you're shedding your uterine lining, you're dropping out that cells, you're bleeding it out. And then, kind of as you're going through that follicular phase, estrogen's being increased. That's going to be a predominantly estrogen forward phase. You're kind of growing up those, like maturing those those follicles within, your reproduction area. And you're making sure that it's preparing to release an egg. Okay. So this estrogen, those ovaries, like they're just getting ready to release an egg. Okay. So first part of that cycle can range. That's one thing I want you to understand. That first part of your cycle, it can vary. If you're stressed, if you've been traveling, if you are a lot of big changes, if you've lost weight, if you've gained weight, if you're training for a competition, your follicular phase, if it's always like 12 days, could increase to 20. It can increase a little bit down. There's an ebb and flow that can happen within that follicular phase according to what's happening in your life, which means it can affect when your ovulation occurs. Okay. Not only that, but within the follicular phase is where you're going to see that testosterone start to increase. And you usually see that testosterone really start to increase around day 10 leading up to your ovulation, which incestually would make sense. That good, robust amount of testosterone increasing before ovulation, it's going to make your sex drive go up, make you want to mate, for conception. But this is also really important to know because if you want to plan a getaway with your honey, if you want to hit some personal records in the gym, like understanding that you have a robust amount of testosterone leading up to that ovulation is a really good thing to know so that you can understand what you can put on your plate, how you can push yourself, right? So that follicular phase, FSH, you're releasing follicle stimulating hormone. I don't know why I'm like tripping over my words, but FSH is going to stimulate the follicle, getting ready to release the egg, right? That's the follicular phase. Now, when ovulation happens, the follicle releases the egg, and what's left behind is the corpus luteum. Okay. When that egg is released, now you're going into your luteal phase. Now, there shouldn't be big changes in your luteal phase. We're looking at, I like to see a luteal phase between 10 to 12. You can put it 10 to 14 days if you're symptomless, right? If there's nothing crazy happening in your luteal phase, okay, I can see it going to 14, but I like to keep it around 10 to 12 days. That's how it should be consistently. If it's under that 9 days, if it's 15, 16, 17 days, big red flag that there's something going on with those hormones that are predominant in that phase, which is going to be progesterone. Now, when that egg is released, the egg has to be released. Let me repeat that. The egg has to be released to release progesterone. Now, what I have found is the only understanding that a majority of the women that I work with had what they understand about egg release and progesterone has to do with getting pregnant. So I got to release an egg to get pregnant, and I got to have enough progesterone to, have a healthy, pregnancy and not miscarry, which is true. But what's really important to understand for women, progesterone is a very calming, protective hormone. It works on GABA receptors in the brain. And so that works on your ability to fall asleep and get good rest, right? It's your ability to, and not just getting good rest, but getting deep sleep, restorative sleep. It affects our emotional stability, how we view the world, if we're happy, if we're sad. And that's a really big deal because there's so many women. We've made PMS, like the act of PMSing, we've normalized something that's not normal. We've made jokes about it in TV shows and movies. Oh, spouses, doctors write it off like it's this idea of like, oh, you must be on your period. Oh, like I've had one woman, there's a testimonial on my website where like she would say like she loves great kids, great husband, but leading up to her cycle, she would have to like kind of lock herself away in a room because it was just so hard to just deal and she didn't want to lose her cool. And we've normalized this. We've normalized this idea of like feeling more depressed, feeling more anxious, emotionally unstable, bloating, having all these loose stools, like leading up to her cycle. We've made it a normal part of being a woman when it's not normal. Those things are not normal. You should not be experiencing all those things. And progesterone is a big part of that. The ability to ovulate, which is release an egg, is really, really important, not just for having a baby, but for your overall well-being, how you view the world, how you view yourself, how you view others, how you're able to be resilient, if you can adapt to stress. It is not all in your head. It feels out of control because it is out of control. Your hormones are out of control. Your brain is feeling out of control. There's that imbalance and you're feeling it because it's real. And it's not just because you're about to bleed, it's because the hormones that should be there are not there. It could be that you don't have enough progesterone, that your progesterone is, going down too fast. Like there could be different things. But when you understand how you're feeling and what symptoms or things are happening on what day of your menstrual cycle, then you can take a step back and say, okay, yeah, I got to do something about this. And I had someone whose doctor put her on antidepressants for 2 weeks out of her cycle because she struggled with that. That's crazy. So 2 weeks out of the cycle, something's up. Why don't we take a second and evaluate that, right? I also had someone in my office who was having gallbladder attacks for years. And when we finally met and we sat down and we walked through it, she just kept saying how she kept having these, gallbladder attacks. And I was like, you know what? This sounds very cyclical. Like it's coming back. Let's start tracking it. Plus her history of having a history of like signs of estrogen dominance, menstrual cycle issues. I said, let's go ahead and track when your gallbladder attacks happen and let's track your menstrual cycle. But she was like, no, I know when my ovulation is. I was like, no, we're going to track it. We're going to track day one bleed to next bleed. We're going to track how you bled. Is it light? Is it heavy? We're going to track any spotting. We're going to track cervical fluid. We're going to track temperature shifts. And then we're going to track if there's any, things that happen in the luteal phase. And what we ended up finding is that she had such high estrogen that every time around her ovulation, that would trigger, there would be a spike, of luteinizing hormone, spike of estrogen leading up to her ovulation, and it would trigger a gallbladder attack because the gallbladder has receptors for a rich amount, like a good amount of receptors for estrogen. So she had done all these things, gallbladder cleanses, all this gallbladder support, and we had to take a step back. We didn't do much with the gallbladder. We went after allowing the body, like supporting the body to clear estrogen. So tracking your cycle is really, really important. Now, so taking charge of your fertility, again, I'll put, link here. They have graph, like a document that you can use. Now, there are apps that will track the signs that you're tracking. Like you can just put it in. But what I think is really important is to do it on paper. Do it on paper for 3 to 4 cycles. And the reason why is because you've got to visually see it. It's not the same putting it in an app and they show you a graph. You've got to see it. And when I walk women through tracking their cycle and I show them the different, ebbs and flow, when I can show them what's happening here and here, to visually see it all on paper is powerful. It's this realization that, oh my gosh, my body's incredible. Like it's giving me all of this information that I can use to not only be better, feel better, heal better. It's just all there. And when you can see that it's consistently giving you this information, it's powerful, powerful stuff. So what it is, it's a graph. And so the 3 things you can, well, let me not say 3. These are the things I always have, and I mentioned it a little bit already. These are the things that I have all the women I work with and all the women in my membership group to track. Is number 1, you got to track your temperature, basal body temperature. And the way you do that is you've got to be asleep for at least 3 hours, right? So if, like you're nursing a baby or you get up to go pee and it's at 5, but you wake up at 7, I like to make sure that you're well rested in a really rested state, that basal body temp, right? So you have at least 3 consecutive hours. So if you go up to pee at 4, but then you wake up at 7, you can take your temp. Now you're going to take a thermometer. You're going to take a good thermometer that can go 0.00, right? And you're going to put it under your tongue and you're just going to hold it there before you take your temperature. Let it get, under your tongue, let it kind of acclimate there and then take your temperature without moving. I don't want you to pee. I don't want you to go look in the mirror. I don't want you to drink some water on your side table. I don't want you to look at your phone. Just wake up, grab that thermometer and put it under your tongue, track that temperature. Now, the great thing for those with thyroid, want to understand their thyroid more, is that that temperature can also be used to track, are you too low with your thyroid hormones? Are you in better levels with your thyroid hormones? And I'll touch base on that here in a second. But what you should see is over your menstrual cycle, you should see that in your follicular phase, your temp's a little bit lower than in your luteal phase. And what'll end up happening is you'll see temps, kind of going throughout your follicular phase. I will say this, the goal is to look at the overall pattern. You're going to have random spikes. There's going to be random like temperatures that don't make sense with the other ones, right? It might be that you were tossing and turning in your sleep, you didn't sleep well, you had alcohol, you might be fighting something. The idea isn't to say like, oh my gosh, there's one up here and there's one all the way down here. The idea is that a majority of them will show a pattern, right? A majority. You're going to have these little outliers. You're not paying attention to that. But a majority of your follicular phase should be lower. Then what you'll see leading up to your ovulation is you're going to see a dip in that temperature, and it should spike up. And then you should see, and we're not talking about like if you're seeing 97.5, 97.8, 99. No, you're going to see like, 97.5, 97.8, and then it might go up to 98.1, 98.3. But when you're tracking it, you will see that shift go up. And when you have a few consecutive points of higher temperatures, 4 to 5 consecutive points of higher temperature in your in your luteal phase, then hey, I ovulated, I'm in my luteal phase. And then you track that. That's what you should see. A lot of you guys might start tracking and might not see that, especially if you have some symptoms going on, especially if your thyroid hormone levels aren't optimal. You might not see that. And that's okay. That's where you start. If you need to go deeper, if you have any issues with that, of course, you guys can always join my membership group and we can go dive deeper into that. We're going to be doing a whole deep dive with different examples on this in that group. So make sure to check it out at my website. I'll add a link in the show notes. But that's what you should be seeing, right? What I also have women track is their cervical fluid. Now, I'm going to give credit to Taking Charge of Your Fertility. When I first read about this, years ago, I remember I think there's a whole chapter there where it talks about cervical discharge versus cervical fluid. And what was so interesting to me and just kind of blew my mind is that cervical fluid is normal. Being wet certain days, seeing things on your underwear, that's normal. That does not mean something is wrong. Obviously, if there's a smell to it, if there's a coloring to it, there's such things as infection. But the thing that frustrated me is that we're taught, and we teach young girls because we don't talk about it, that the cervical fluid is cervical discharge. Ooh, I just shut that down because cervical discharge is this idea that something's wrong. No, cervical fluid is great. It is telling you where you're at in your menstrual cycle, is a sign of healthy hormone production. There's nothing negative about it. So when women would sit and they would talk about the cervical discharge, I tracked my cervical discharge, I'd say, that's not discharge. And they would laugh. Oh, no, I know, Dr. Becca. I say, I know, but we cannot call it that. It's cervical fluid. It is a normal part of our menstrual cycle. So you should see that cervical fluid changing consistency, especially leading up to your ovulation. And even in the book, it shows kind of like what it looks like. But usually kind of like egg yolky as you're leading up. Like egg yolk is going to be your most fertile fluid that you're going to see. It can be dry, it can be creamy at the beginning or like as you're leading up to ovulation. But egg yolk type of fluid means you're really fertile, right? But then once you've ovulated, it should dry up. And if it's dried up, you've ovulated, right? Really, really, really good information. Second thing or third thing I like to look at is, how are you bleeding? Are you bleeding heavy for 5 days, 7 days, 8 days? Is it light? Oh man, how many women I've spoken to that might bleed for a day and they're just really, really light. Might not even really need to use a, pad on the third day. Maybe use a panty liner. Like, you have to understand that how much you're bleeding, how long for, is really great information. You got to know that. You've got to understand that. Also, your digestive system. Is there a lot of loose stools? Are you feeling backed up? And a lot of times, through the years, I've had women say, like, yeah, sometimes I get constipated, or sometimes I feel like I have loose stools, and not even realize that it's around certain parts of their cycle. That gives us some information. Do you feel bloated? That gives us information, right? And there are things that shift and change, right? Some bloating, right? Like you can see some shift in water retention, but the idea that a lot of people can feel really bloated, we're gaining like 5 pounds, and just your digestive system has changed, that's a big red flag. And what I think is really important, really, really important to track, is how you're feeling. Do you feel at certain points where you catch yourself feeling really, really down? Do you feel more anxious? Do you feel like you can't handle as much? Like before you even go walk out of your room, you've already reached like your BS level, right? Like I can't deal with any more BS today and the day hasn't even started. Track that. How you feel is important in your body. When you feel something shift inside of you, that is important. That's not something to be written off. You want to track how you're feeling. You want to track those emotions, right? You also want to track if there's spotting. Do you have bleeding that shows up at different times? Do you find yourself wanting more sweets? There's nothing wrong with that. I've worked with women that have done fantastic on keto, and I'll never forget. A few years ago, I was walking a woman through some troubleshooting, and she just was beating herself up because she's like, oh my gosh, around my ovulation, I just want ice cream and all this stuff. And I end up, like binging on it. I feel like I end up eating. And I'm like, no, 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 listen to your body. If your body is saying around ovulation, it needs more of these carbs, then plan for that. Instead of trying to restrict yourself, plan for the carbs that aren't going to spike your blood sugar and cause more insulin issues for you, right? Plan to utilize those more complex carbs, plan to use more food, like more, natural food sources, carbs, instead of going out and trying to restrict yourself when your body's telling you it needs something during that menstrual cycle. So all of that information is really, really important. Now, when it comes to testing, that's the first place you got to start. You're going to get yourself a thermometer. You're going to go get your taking charge of your fertility book. You're going to go to show notes. You're going to both start there, right? Now, when it comes to testing, there's two different ways to do testing. I'm going to tell you the basic way. I'm going to tell you my favorite way that I will literally brag about this way till the day I die because I think it's amazing. But number one, the first thing I'm going to point out is that you should be getting blood work at certain times in your cycle. Doctor, how many times have I heard, Dr. Rebecca, I went in to my OB, they did blood work and everything looked fine. Where were you in your menstrual cycle? I don't know. They just said I could take blood work whenever. No, ma'am. You've got to get blood work done at the correct time in your cycle if that's what you want to do. Testosterone, you can test whenever. I ideally like it in the morning. Getting that testosterone. I like blood work overall in the morning. I just think it's better. Now, if you want to check, if you want to just do estrogen, you want to do FSH, even luteinizing hormone, you can do day 3 of your cycle. If you need to know the signaling, FSH and LH are pituitary hormones. If you want to know if you're signaling, if you want to know if you might be going into perimenopause, or if you're in perimenopause, checking those hormones can be really helpful. Day 3 of your cycle. But when should you be testing your estrogen and your progesterone, estradiol and your progesterone? You should be testing it within 5 to 7 days of ovulation, which a roundabout time would be around day 19 to 21 in a like 26 to 28 day cycle, right? Like a 28-day cycle. Let me correct that. For like, let's say if you have around a 28-day cycle, day 19 to 21. But if you have more, if you have less, you can kind of move those dates. But this is why it's really important to track your menstrual cycle so you know where you're at in ovulation, so you can go and get good blood work done. So you can know, because that many days post ovulation, so luteal phase is predominantly progesterone, but there is an increase of estrogen, just like the small increase of estrogen, where you can get a good like reading on both progesterone and estrogen in the luteal phase. Now, DHEA is another sex hormone. I am not going to have a chance to go into that in this episode, But if you do need to get DHEA, it should be DHEA-S that should be tested. Make sure you're getting an S. It's better to test when we're looking at your hormones. So it's really important to understand that if you're going to go get estradiol, progesterone, FSH, LH, that you're doing it at the right time in your cycle, right? But the best way to test for hormones is the Dutch test. Hands down. The way that I have over and over again, I could look at your Dutch test. I've just done so many of it and also geek out on it. The fact that we can look at what your body is showing us, look at that along with, your tracking in your menstrual cycle. The fact that we can put those two together and get so much information that helps you. I can look at just your Dutch test and I can explain so much without you having to tell me something. That's how incredible your body is at giving us these different signs that we can test. Now, Dutch test is a urine test. It tests your hormone metabolites. It looks at estrogen, progesterone, but it looks at estradiol, estrone, estriol. We're looking at DHEA. We're looking at testosterone, free testosterone, DHEAS. It's looking at your adrenals. It's looking at your organic acid. So we're looking at signs of, are you methylating good? Do you have enough B vitamins? Do you have enough of certain neurotransmitters? Like incredible. Are you under a lot of oxidative stress? So what it does is it looks at everything as a whole, looks at progesterone, what's making up that progesterone, the alpha or the beta, the testosterone metabolites, alpha and the beta. And what I love about it is that it gives you so much information to not just understand your body, but understand what you can do to help your body to prevent things later on. If you don't have symptoms, every woman I've worked with through the years, that is my one recommendation to do long term. That should be your hormone testing every year, every 2 years, to make sure things are good, to make sure there isn't anything that needs to be addressed. It's so thorough that when I do finally put it all together and I walk women through it, they just sit there just shocked. A lot of women with tears in their eyes saying, this is literally how I felt. This is literally what I've seen happen during my cycle. It's just so nice to know that, I see it now on paper, a lot of information. So if you are at that point where you're like, listen, you can jump all in, start tracking, do the Dutch test. I'll put a link on the Dutch test in my show notes. You can do that. But you don't have to jump into the deep end. Beautiful deep end. I love the deep end when it comes to the Dutch test. But just start off with just understanding what your body's saying, where it's at, what it's doing. Start tracking. Get the book, print out the papers, get the thermometer, and then go from there. Another thing as I wrap this up that I'm going to actually put in the show notes because I have to double check some things is there are trackers. After I finished doing like paper tracking, I was able to use a lady comp that would track my cycles and my temperatures for me. And I did that for 5 years because I was lazy and it was just with school, just everything. It was just easier to have something do it for me. It's not an app, it's an actual device. It's an investment, but my device lasted, I had it for I used it for 5 years. I had it for 7 and then I lost it. So I probably could have kept using it, even though they had a lot of more updated technology. I'll make sure to add some links, so alternatives to that, in case after you do it, you don't want to keep doing paper, you don't want to use an app, you want to just have a device that does it for you. A lot of incredible stuff out there that has been developed to help women, track their cycles, understand themselves, and get a lot of really good information. So as I always say, if you listen to this episode and you want some help, you want to go deeper, check out my Thyroid Inner Circle. If you have any questions, make sure to check out my website. If you want any follow-up questions, I love to try to do some Q&A follow-ups. So if you have anything I talked about, so go to my website, drrebeccawarren.com, submit your question there. But this is just an introduction on understanding your cycle, understanding that connection, and start moving in the right direction. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to leave a 5-star review. I love being able to see and read how this information is helping you on your health journey. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way, when new episodes are live, you can have it automatically downloaded to wherever you listen to your podcast. The number one question I get asked is, how do I work with you? If you are interested in finding out more information about me and being a part of my community, go to my website, drrebeccawarren.com. That's dr.rebeccawarren.com. And you should be able to find the answer to your questions there, as well as checking out my Thyroid Inner Circle membership group, getting access to the free Thyroid Labs ebook that I have available for you, and so much more great information.